Welcome to the deep dive. This week, the stack of sources we've processed, it reads less like the evening news and more like the script for some high-stakes geopolitical thriller.
It really does.
We're dealing with global conflicts, financial tremors that, threaten to upend the entire established system, and frankly, some shocking domestic revelations.
It's a lot to get through.
It is. Our mission, as always, is to act as your guides. We're here to help you extract those definitive nuggets of knowledge and insight from this chaos. We need to figure out what you, the informed listener, truly need to know from this incredibly dramatic week.
And the material, though it's overwhelming, it has a very clear central message.
Which is?
The world is accelerating toward a hard, undeniable multipolar reality. Washington's traditional playbook, financial dominance, military primacy, unilateral action, it's failing. It's failing across the board.
So today we're going to get into that.
We will. We'll rigorously analyze this rising defiance against U.S. power. We'll look very closely at the critical flashpoints in places like Venezuela and Ukraine. And I think most importantly, we have to examine the self-inflicted financial pressures that are threatening the existing Western economic architecture.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our core objective here is clarity. We are focusing heavily on the internal contradictions within U.S. foreign policy.
That gap. Right, the gap between what Washington wants to happen and what's actually happening on the ground.
Exactly. And we'll also be tracking this irreversible shift in global economic gravity away from the West and toward Asia and the global South. The thematic areas defining this shift are, I think, fourfold.
So we're looking at, first, the tangible signs of U.S. decline and strategic fatigue.
Then that extremely dangerous Venezuela flashpoint.
The brutal industrial reality of the Ukraine war.
And finally, the profound economic and financial instability that is just rocking the world's reserve currency system. This is a deep dive into institutional decay.
It is.
So let's begin where all great empires face their reckoning, on the battlefield. Our sources paint a very clear picture that U.S. foreign policy today is, well, it seems fundamentally disconnected from realistic assessments.
Wishful thinking is the term one analyst used.
Wishful thinking. But where has that wishful thinking proved most costly, and what does that tell us about the U.S.'s ability to, impose its will?
You have to start with the foundational military defeats.
Yeah.
You just have to, because they send the loudest global signal.
Afghanistan.
The withdrawal from Afghanistan wasn't some policy pivot. It wasn't a decision that the U.S. got bored and just decided to move on.
No.
It was a defeat. After 2 decades of occupation, trillions of dollars spent, the United States was demonstrably beaten by the Taliban.
And they took control of the country.
They took control. And that single event just shattered the global perception of U.S. invincibility.
That defeat was colossal. I mean, not just for the personnel involved, but for the geopolitical calculus of every capital around the world, especially those looking for an opportunity to push back.
Absolutely. The highly visible failure in Afghanistan created this massive confidence ripple effect.
And we're seeing that play out now.
You see it most clearly now in the Middle East. Consider the Yemenis, the Houthis. They're proving they can successfully challenge the U.S. Navy, that they can disrupt global shipping lanes.
Something that was unthinkable just a few years ago.
Unthinkable.
Yeah.
And critically, you see it with Iran. Iran has managed to stare down the massive military machinery of the U.S. and actually force it to blink multiple times over things like oil tanker seizures or retaliatory strikes.
For decades, no one dared challenge the U.S. in those waterways.
No one. Not conventionally, not unconventionally now. They are. And that changes the risk assessment for every nation defying Washington.
And speaking of military projection, we have to address the sheer physical footprint of the U.S. military. We're talking about, over 800 military bases worldwide? It's an almost unimaginable scale.
It is. And our sources raise some really serious questions about the strategic benefit of that footprint in today's environment.
Are they assets or liabilities?
That's the debate. In the age of precision-guided munitions, are these bases assets or liabilities? If the U.S. were to initiate a conflict with a major regional power, say Iran, or China, analysts argue these forward-deployed bases, which are fixed, easily identified.
They'd become simple targets.
They'd become simple targets. They were sitting ducks for long-range missile strikes. Their very existence forces the U.S. military to expend massive resources just defending them instead of projecting force effectively.
So this whole global network might actually be an artifact of 20th century warfare.
That's the argument, that it's actively weakening 21st century power projection.
And what's equally revealing is the internal political conflict surrounding these commitments. We saw this institutional struggle play out so openly with the NDAA bill this year.
The internal division is fascinating. It really pits the political will of the administration against the institutional consensus of the foreign policy establishment.
The permanent government, as some call it.
Exactly. The NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, it was passed by Congress with specific language forbidding the president from withdrawing troops from Europe.
Even if he wanted to.
Even if the executive branch, or the president himself, determines that a troop withdrawal is strategically sound or fiscally necessary, these legacy interests are using legislative mechanisms to enforce global entanglement.
So it proves that the foreign policy is often set by the Washington institutional class, not by the elected officials.
That's right.
Okay, so let's shift our gaze to the Western Hemisphere, a region Washington has traditionally viewed as its own undisputed sphere of influence.
Its own backyard.
The current U.S. national security strategy, the NSS, is clearly aiming for a revival of this control, something that's being dubbed Monroe Doctrine 2.0.
That's the official framing. The NSS outlines a strategy to reassert complete primacy in the Western Hemisphere, explicitly mentioning nations like Venezuela and even strategic locations like Greenland.
So this Monroe 2.0 is the formal attempt to lock down the U.S. backyard.
It is. However, this old doctrine is encountering a powerful new reality. And that reality is China's massive economic gravity.
And we are seeing Latin American countries from Brazil to Peru actively turning away from Washington's orbit. So what is the fundamental difference in diplomacy that allows this shift?
The contrast is just stark.
Yeah.
And it boils down to the difference between value and values.
Okay, explain that.
When U.S. diplomats arrive in capitals like Brasilia or Lima, they often come, as our sources describe it, with empty hands and long lists of demands.
Right, they'll lecture.
They focus on lecturing about governance, social issues, and endlessly warning against the dangers of doing business with Beijing. They offer very little in terms of real, shovel-ready investment.
But China comes with money and infrastructure.
Precisely. China operates entirely on the axis of value. They offer concrete, tangible deliverables. They build railways for moving raw goods. They deploy crucial 5G networks. They construct modern ports.
And in exchange.
In exchange, they secure long-term access to essential resources: soy, copper, lithium. The practical structural results are already evident. China's state grid has effectively bought and now controls Brazil's entire national electricity grid.
Wow.
This is strategic resource control on a massive scale. When a developing nation is desperate for growth, tangible value wins over moralizing values every single time.
So when Washington sees this gravitational pull failing, how does it attempt to maintain influence in a region that's clearly moving on?
It resorts to threats and coercion. It's the only tool left.
Rare.
It attempts to retain influence through fear-threatening punitive tariffs, initiating reviews of existing trade agreements. This, as one source noted, is the diplomacy of a fading power.
Right. A strong power attracts allies. A declining one tries to enforce loyalty.
Exactly. But because the economic alternative provided by China is so powerful, this fear is rapidly losing its bite.
This aggressive, fear-based diplomacy brings us directly to the Venezuela flashpoint. This has become arguably the most dangerous military and legal risk the administration is currently running.
The level of escalation here is alarming.
It starts with a maritime blockade and seizing oil tankers, an action our sources describe explicitly as an act of piracy.
And it goes beyond the illegal seizures. The administration is making highly visible military deployments that signal potential kinetic action. We're talking about specialized military quick strike forces.
Like the CV-22 Ospreys?
Right, the Ospreys, which are designed to rapidly insert special operations forces. We're seeing C-7 cargo planes being stationed in Puerto Rico. These deployments are geared toward potential imminent strikes or on-the-ground terror exercises.
Aimed at what?
Aimed at nothing less than a rapid decapitation of the Maduro regime.
And this posturing is happening even though major global players like Russia and China are actively underwriting Venezuela's stability.
And that is the critical factor that's preventing a total collapse. Russia and China have publicly, repeatedly condemned the U.S. actions. Crucially, they continue to provide deep military and economic partnerships.
They're insulating Venezuela.
They're effectively insulating it from the worst effects of U.S. sanctions. They're calling Washington's
That
bluff,
fake.
knowing that any direct military intervention against Venezuela risks collateral damage involving Russian or Chinese assets. That just increases the stakes exponentially.
And yet, Washington continues to push this policy. Is there a strategic rationale that justifies this level of risk, especially domestically?
According to the analysis, no. The policy is being widely deemed off the charts stupid.
Why?
Because the risk of a single incident, a U.S. ship being sunk, or hundreds of servicemen being killed in some ill-conceived raid, it would instantly jeopardize the administration's top domestic political priority,
Which is the midterm elections.
which is maintaining a positive economic and military narrative ahead of the upcoming midterms. The potential military humiliation far outweighs any perceived gain from toppling a regime.
And here is where the Venezuela policy becomes truly disturbing and legally very questionable: the deportation scandal. This just demonstrates the lengths the administration is willing to go for propaganda.
This is a profound institutional abuse. The administration invoked the 1798 Alien Enemies Act.
Let's take a moment on that. What is that?
It's an archaic wartime measure passed during the quasi-war with France. It allows the president to detain or deport non-citizens from a hostile country without any due process.
A 227-year-old act.
And they use this to label 700,000 Venezuelans residing in the U.S. as enemy soldiers.
That designation alone is extraordinary.
It is, and it facilitated an illegal deportation operation. These weren't violent offenders. We're talking about non-violent individuals, including a well-known gay rights activist, professional goalkeeper, all of whom were residing legally or seeking asylum.
And they weren't sent back to Venezuela?
No. Instead of being returned to Venezuela, they were illegally deported to a supermax prison in El Salvador. This move, according to sources, was solely for propaganda purposes, to stage a display of hardline deportation while entirely bypassing the due process that is supposedly guaranteed even under the 1798 statute itself.
So they were essentially being turned into political props, violating fundamental constitutional principles, international law, by sending them to a third country known for human rights abuses.
It highlights the extreme and legally questionable measures being deployed. Using an archaic wartime act against peaceful residents and then rendering them to a foreign supermax prison. It shows a profound disregard for the rule of law, all to satisfy a hardline political narrative at home.
This aggressive foreign policy, the massive costs associated with maintaining a global empire, it all demands overwhelming financial outlay.
Of course.
And that fiscal stress is now manifesting in the collapse of trust in the dollar system, leading us directly into what sources are calling the Great Repricing. Let's look at the financial panic signals.
The most immediate signal is the behavior of precious metals. They're going parabolic.
The numbers are staggering.
Gold is nearing $4,500 an ounce. Silver is surging toward $72 an ounce, which is an incredible 140% gain in 2025 alone.
This isn't just a market fluctuation.
No, this is a clear sign that investors, institutions, central banks, they are frantically rushing to protect themselves. Because fiat currencies, especially the dollar, are rapidly losing purchasing power. This indicates a deep, systemic lack of faith in the stability of paper money.
Yet, Washington is still trying to project economic strength. We saw U.S. GDP growth reported at a healthy 4.3% in Q4. But our sources, they reject this figure as phony growth. What does that mean in practical terms?
It means that growth is not driven by increased productivity or innovation or genuine consumer health. It is entirely reliant on borrowed money.
So it's built on debt.
The U.S. economy is currently surviving on the charity of global and domestic creditors. The current deficit spending is $1.88 trillion. That accounts for nearly 6% of the entire U.S. economy.
So without that borrowing?
Without this constant, massive level of borrowing, this fiscal stimulus, the U.S. economy would instantly contract into a deep and severe recession. Its growth fueled by debt, which is fundamentally unsustainable.
And that leads directly to the debt crisis facing the new Treasury Secretary. He's inheriting an impossible situation.
It's a mathematical nightmare. That's how the sources describe it. The Treasury has to sell an immediate $3 trillion in new debt just to keep the government liquid, to pay its bills.
And the problem is finding buyers.
The enormous problem is that major historical creditors like China and Japan are actively running for the exits. They're demanding higher compensation, a term premium, to hold U.S. dollar debt for 10 years.
Because they're worried.
They are deeply concerned over inflation risk, perceived U.S. insolvency, and the obvious geopolitical risk of holding weaponized U.S. assets.
If the solution is just to keep spending and keep printing, what is the underlying economic philosophy driving the administration right now? It sounds like an exercise in voodoo economics.
That is the terminology being used. The administration appears focused on sacrificing the stability and the reserve status of the dollar just to keep the BS going indefinitely.
How would they do that?
The plan involves ensuring a loyalist is appointed as the next Fed chair, someone who will aggressively lower interest rates regardless of rising inflation figures, all in pursuit of an eternal market rally.
And the consequence of that?
The consequence is devastatingly clear to the rest of the world. Washington is explicitly willing to debase its currency to avoid an economic collapse now. It proves the dollar's stability is secondary to Washington's immediate political and fiscal objectives.
This financial weaponization had a predictable and severe effect on Beijing, which is now retaliating financially. We're seeing major liquidation of U.S. debt.
China is dumping U.S. treasuries at a pace we have not seen since the height of the 2008 global financial crisis.
They've learned their lesson.
They have learned a fatal lesson. The U.S. weaponized the financial system by freezing Russian assets, imposing wide-ranging sanctions. This proved unequivocally to Beijing that the dollar is merely a political lease.
Not a neutral reserve currency.
Not at all. They see no incentive whatsoever in financing their biggest rival's economy, especially when that rival has demonstrated it can lock the system on a political whim. The pivot away from the dollar is now a national security imperative for China.
And this retaliation is moving beyond bonds and into critical commodities, the rare earth war.
That's a crucial dimension. China views securing its supply lines as paramount. In November, they reduced rare earth magnet exports to the U.S. by 11%.
And these are critical components.
Essential. They're in everything from precision-guided missiles to advanced computing chips. Beijing is prioritizing security of supply over performance of its exports. They're willing to sacrifice short-term revenue to gain strategic leverage and accelerate their own technological independence.
Because they know how reliant the U.S. defense and tech sectors are?
They know full well.
And despite all the tariffs and pressure from Washington, China's overall economic strength seems utterly unbowed. The trade war results are counterintuitive.
The data supports that. China's overall goods trade surplus surged by 21% year over year to a record $1.1 trillion in the first 11 months of 2025.
And here's the critical detail.
This is the detail that summarizes the entire failure of the trade war. This record surplus was achieved despite a massive 29% year-over-year decline in shipments specifically to the United States.
So they just found other customers.
China successfully diversified its trade to the Global South and other partners. This cements China's status as the world's indispensable factory floor, and it proves that the U.S. consumer market is no longer the ultimate arbiter of China's economic health. The economic war has failed.
If the dollar system is being weaponized, it naturally erodes trust not just in the U.S., but in all Western financial institutions. Let's look at the drama surrounding the frozen Russian assets in the EU this week.
Okay, so the European Council ultimately agreed to a substantial $90 billion loan to Ukraine. But this was a loan backed by future EU revenues, not an outright seizure of assets. The real story is what they didn't do.
The original plan.
They abandoned a much larger prior plan for a $140 billion scheme using frozen Russian assets as collateral for the loan.
Why?
This suggests the European governments were spooked. They were clearly worried by Russia's successful legal claims in multiple European and international jurisdictions, arguing that asset seizure violates property rights.
So the attempt to seize or even use those assets as collateral essentially backfired. It served as a warning to the rest of the world.
Precisely. It served as a massive discredit to Western finance. It proved that assets held in Western institutions are contingent on your political relationship with Washington and Brussels.
And that instability just pushes countries toward alternatives.
It accelerates the development of alternative financial structures, like the BRICS payment system, the expansion of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It was institutional suicide. They sacrificed centuries of property rights credibility for a short-term political gain they couldn't even achieve.
And as the West cannibalizes its own system, its closest allies are suffering disproportionately. Germany, the industrial heart of Europe, is a prime example of a nation being structurally dismantled by its own friend.
German de-industrialization is a tragedy, and it's a direct consequence of U.S. policy regarding the Ukraine conflict and the energy crisis that followed.
How so?
By forcing the end of Russian gas imports and making Europe rely on expensive LNG shipments, Washington forced Germany to pay up to 400% more for energy than its global competitors in the U.S. or China.
A massive wealth transfer.
The largest, most effective structural wealth transfer from Europe to America since World War II.
And once that energy-intensive industry leaves, it doesn't come back easily, right?
Absolutely. When a massive chemical plant or a steel blast furnace is turned off, the investment required to restart it in a high-energy cost environment is prohibitive.
So where is it going?
German industry, the foundational sectors like chemical, steel, glass manufacturing, is moving overseas, primarily to industrial parks in Houston and in China.
So Germany, once the world's export engine,
Is now on a path to becoming a mere service economy, effectively functioning as a vassal of U.S. finance and Chinese production. The U.S. has successfully eliminated its biggest industrial competitor in Europe, not with bombs, but through strategic economic strangulation.
that economic fallout brings us directly back to the conflict in Ukraine, the source of so much of this global stress. Despite the financial weaponization and the monumental investment by the West, the conflict seems stuck in a highly destructive and costly holding pattern.
That is the hard truth. The West's colossal commitment, roughly $300 billion over 4 years in aid, has, according to our analysis, backfired spectacularly.
How so?
Instead of leading to decisive gains or a better negotiating position for Kyiv, this massive investment has only facilitated heavy Ukrainian attrition and worsening military outcomes.
And more money won't change that.
Sources suggest that continuing this investment, maybe another $200 billion over the next 2 years, is unlikely to yield a better result. The military conditions for Ukraine are far worse now than they were in 2022.
Here's where the analysis becomes so critical. The sheer industrial capabilities of the combatants. Russia is succeeding largely because its military-industrial complex is operating on a wartime footing, something the West has failed to achieve.
The gap in industrial output is the decisive factor. Russia's ability to produce more military equipment, more shells, more drones, more tanks, than the combined output of the West is staggering.
And that success is attributed to state pressure.
Unrelenting state pressure on the Russian military-industrial complex. The government views this as an existential imperative, forcing continuous, round-the-clock production increases. This is in stark contrast to the West's failure to transition from a peacetime economy.
Which relies on, what? Corporate profit incentives?
Exactly. Incremental learning curves and corporate profit incentives, which are just ill-suited for a grinding war of attrition.
And speaking of the West's failure to adapt, we have a grim, unending catalog of failure when we look at U.S. military procurement programs, especially surface warship construction.
It is an embarrassing history of failures over the last 3 decades.
Let's run through them.
We start with the Zumwalt-class destroyers. Intended to be stealthy, technologically advanced, equipped with futuristic weapons like railguns, only 3 were built before the program was effectively canceled.
Then the littoral combat ship.
The LCS program, widely acknowledged as a disaster. The ships were too fragile, underarmed, incapable of operating in high-threat environments.
And the current program, the Constellation-class frigate, is it following the same trajectory?
Unfortunately, yes. It was initially based on a simpler, cheaper European design, I think Italian. But once the U.S. military-industrial complex got its hands on the design, it followed the classic pattern.
Bigger, heavier, more expensive.
Bigger, heavier, more complex, and exponentially more expensive. This chronic inability to build functional, cost-effective surface warships points directly to the systemic dysfunction that prevents the West from meeting Russia's output. The system itself is broken.
And the response to this long history of failure is even more ambitious and arguably disconnected from reality.
It is pure wishful thinking writ large. There is now a proposal, reportedly coming from the administration, to build a huge fleet of 32 new super battleships.
What does that even mean?
They're proposed to be double the size of the current missile destroyers, equipped with unproven technologies like railguns and advanced lasers.
Given the track record.
Given the absolute failure of every complex warship program for the last 30 years, and the tactical reality that modern warfare makes large surface targets extremely vulnerable, this plan is viewed by most analysts as utterly misconceived. It's unlikely to ever materialize beyond a drawing board fantasy.
Now let's turn to a major strategic escalation that occurred this week deep inside Russian territory.
This was a highly significant event because it targeted Russia's industrial heartland. Ukrainian drones struck the Akron chemical facility near Moscow and Veliki Novgorod.
What do they produce there?
This sprawling industrial complex produces ammonia and nitrogen-based compounds. Critically, These compounds are the fundamental precursors needed for manufacturing high explosives,
So in this war of attrition,
which is defined by artillery and shell usage. Akron was essentially the central bank for Putin's war efforts' ammunition supply.
and the strike caused catastrophic damage, going beyond just a simple factory closure.
The initial drone strike hit a storage tank, but this was followed by a massive, catastrophic secondary detonation. It was consistent with the ignition of hundreds of tons of stored ammonia.
And the fallout from that.
Analysis from chemical engineers suggests the facility could be shut down for months, possibly years. It fundamentally disrupts Russia's ability to maintain high explosive production levels. This strike has strategic consequences that reverberate far beyond the immediate damage.
What does this mean for Russian strategy on the front lines? It forces a critical choice.
Exactly. This creates a painful, forced choice scenario for Russia. To protect the capital and the regime, which history shows authoritarian systems always prioritize, Russia has been forced to pull its most advanced air defense assets.
Yes, 400s.
The S-400 systems. They're pulling them from the front lines and redeploying them to defend Moscow and St. Petersburg. Every S-400 battery moved north is one less system covering forces in Zaporizhia or Donbass.
So they have to choose between defending their industrial capacity or sustaining the offensive.
That's the choice. Defend the capital or sustain the offensive deep in Ukrainian territory.
And this places Putin in a classic strategic dilemma regarding a public response.
He is trapped between two bad options. If he orders massive, hardline retaliation strikes against Ukrainian cities or infrastructure, he risks accelerating Western military support.
Potentially triggering deeper NATO involvement.
Right. But if he chooses not to escalate, he looks impotent, incapable of defending his homeland at the exact moment he is trying to project strength both domestically and in diplomatic negotiations.
So Ukraine designed this attack specifically to put him in this difficult position.
Precisely. It makes the narrative that Russia is winning much harder to sell internally and externally.
Speaking of negotiations, we are witnessing multiple layers of diplomatic double-dealing right now. On the surface, Zelensky is still maintaining a highly ambitious position.
Zelensky is maintaining what analysts call a fantasy that he can succeed on his own terms. He's preparing to pitch his 20-point peace plan to the U.S. administration, which includes demands like a 60 to 90-day ceasefire and a final referendum.
So he still believes he has leverage.
This persistence, despite the military reality, suggests a deep-seated belief that he can still coerce the more powerful Russian side into submitting to his terms, likely backed by perceived Western political guarantees.
But our sources suggest there are two very different sets of talks happening, the public spectacle and the secret back channel.
Yes. On the one hand, Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov stated that U.S.-Russia back-channel talks are very close to a solution. This suggests real progress is being made on a military-political settlement behind closed doors.
But at the same time.
Simultaneously, however, the U.S. is engaging in diplomatic double-dealing with Ukraine. Washington is reportedly attempting to bribe the Ukrainians by offering them Article 5-level security guarantees to get them to agree to withdraw from Donbass.
Let's just clarify Article 5 here for you. That is the core of the NATO treaty. It is the mutual defense clause. An attack against one is an attack against all.
So by offering Article 5-level guarantees, the U.S. is offering a promise of military defense, effectively giving Ukraine everything but the NATO membership name.
But they know Russia will never accept that.
The U.S. knows full well that Russia will immediately reject any peace deal that includes such a high-level security guarantee for Kyiv. The move is designed to make it look like the U.S. is achieving progress toward peace, while offering a solution that is guaranteed to fail.
So they can say, we tried everything and then exit.
It sets the stage for a rapid U.S. exit.
It's all about finding an off-ramp while maintaining the illusion of success. And none of this should be a surprise to anyone who followed the history of NATO expansion 20 years ago.
That is the crucial context. Declassified documents detail a 2008 meeting between Russian President Putin and then President George Bush.
And what did Putin say?
Putin warned Bush explicitly about the consequences of NATO expansion into Ukraine and Georgia. He stated that this would inevitably create a long-term field of conflict and ultimately fracture Ukraine. He essentially predicted the current situation with chilling accuracy.
And what was Bush's response?
What is most revealing is Bush's reported response to this complex geopolitical warning, which was simply, why?
Oh, wow.
Why? This highlights the profound intellectual failure, the lack of strategic foresight, and the deep lack of understanding in Washington about the security concerns of a major power, which directly led us to the current crisis.
The ripple effects of this global instability are nowhere clearer than in the Middle East, where we are seeing major tectonic shifts and surprising friction even between the U.S. and its supposed closest ally, Israel.
We have to place current events into a wider historical framework. Our sources constantly remind us of Henry Kissinger's 2012 prophecy that 10 years from now, there's going to be no more Israel,
A prediction that seemed outlandish at the time.
and is now constantly being revisited in light of the current regional security situation and the level of internal instability.
And the friction between the U.S. administration and the Israeli leadership is surprisingly intense.
It is escalating rapidly. Israel is reportedly on a collision course with the Trump administration.
What was the flashpoint?
A highly sensitive flashpoint occurred when Israeli forces viciously attacked a U.S. envoy, Tom Barrack, while he was on the ground in Syria. This forced a strong, direct response, with the president reportedly telling the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to back off or else.
So there's a real rift growing.
The level of anxiety in Israeli leadership regarding a shift in U.S. policy, from unconditional support to transactional pressure, is extremely high. It suggests a genuine growing rift.
But despite the massive human and strategic cost of the ongoing conflicts, the Israeli prime minister seems personally insulated from the fallout.
His personal political calculation is cynical but ruthlessly effective. While his actions are ostensibly aimed at national defense, they are pushing Israel closer to destruction in the long term.
But for him personally,
For Netanyahu personally, he remains a winner because the war allows him to survive politically and stay in power. War justifies unity, it suppresses domestic opposition, it halts legal proceedings against him. He maintains control regardless of the cost to his country's security.
and speaking of security, the Israeli Defense Force, the IDF, often touted as the world's finest military, is facing severe criticism for its performance in the Gaza conflict.
The criticism is intense and highly specific. The IDF has been unable to conquer and dominate the relatively small 350 square kilometer Gaza territory after 26 months of conflict.
Despite surrounding the remaining fighters on all sides.
Exactly. This failure to achieve decisive victory, or even pacify the area after such a long commitment, fundamentally undercuts the propaganda that claims the IDF is the world's finest military force. It suggests the serious mismatch between resources, tactical capability, and strategic goals.
Meanwhile, the geopolitical jostling continues across the Red Sea, evidenced by the Israeli Prime Minister's recognition of Somaliland.
This is a textbook example of realpolitik destabilization. The move to recognize Somaliland as an independent state is viewed as an explicit attempt to balkanize Somalia and gain strategic positioning.
What's the goal?
The goal is twofold. First, to establish a base of operations to target Iran and the Houthis, who operate in the nearby Bab el-Mandeb Strait, and second, to gain a strategic hedge against the neighboring Djibouti,
Which is now heavily influenced by China.
and hosts its first overseas military base. The recognition ensures Israel will have access to Somaliland for military and intelligence purposes, moving it into the Abraham Accords orbit and providing a vital strategic foothold.
Despite this visible positioning for conflict, we also have intelligence contradicting the entire war footing against Iran. This seems to be the ultimate contradiction.
It is absolutely bizarre. The U.S. is actively staging strategic bombers and aircraft carriers out of the remote Diego Garcia Air Base in the Indian Ocean.
Why there?
This staging is necessary because most of the U.S.'s Gulf allies, like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, forbid the U.S. from using their airspace for strikes on Iran. They fear retaliation.
So we have this high-stakes, expensive war footing.
Even though the Director of National Intelligence testified to the Senate Intelligence Committee that Iran is not currently trying to develop a nuclear weapon, having stopped all such ambitions back in 2003.
So Washington is expending massive resources and creating severe geopolitical risk based on a threat that its own intelligence community confirms is currently non-existent.
That's right.
This institutional decay, where officials are actively lying about threats to justify foreign policy, links directly back to the domestic turmoil we saw this week, starting with the latest release of the Epstein files.
The latest document dump was explosive. It confirmed what had long been dismissed as conspiracy theory, that Jeffrey Epstein did not act alone.
What did the files prove?
The files proved that as early as 1999, 10 potential co-conspirators were identified by federal authorities. Critically, 6 of those 10 individuals had already been located and served with federal grand jury subpoenas.
Which directly contradicts the official narrative.
It directly contradicts the long-standing official narrative maintained by the Department of Justice and the FBI that Epstein was a lone pervert.
And the government only made things worse by attempting a cover-up through spectacularly bungled redactions.
The incompetence of the cover-up effort is a story in itself. The DOJ and FBI botched the redactions in the latest documents. It allowed readers to easily copy and paste the blacked-out areas and view the critical, damning information that was meant to be shielded.
So there's real anxiety in the administration.
There is palpable anxiety inside the administration about the exposure, particularly because the current president is reportedly heavily implicated in the files. The joint efforts by powerful political figures to suppress the documents further confirm the high level of political risk involved.
This exposure of the elite leads us straight into the mechanism of political blackmail. A stunning detail surfaced this week involving a former congressman.
Yes, details emerged about an alleged Mossad-linked criminal shakedown attempt against former Congressman Matt Gaetz.
How'd it work?
The core mechanism involved a figure who was the Israeli embassy's PR person, allegedly conveying a message to Gaetz's father demanding $25 million to silence an embarrassing story about the congressman.
And this highlights a terrifying reality.
It does. The incident, which resulted in someone pleading guilty to attempted extortion, highlights how foreign intelligence and criminal shakedown rings can be leveraged as tools for political blackmail inside the U.S., exploiting the vulnerabilities of high-profile political figures.
This culture of political protection and shielding the powerful extends directly into the mainstream media, as evidenced by the shocking CBS kill switch story this week.
This is a profound moment of journalistic failure. The CBS News editor-in-chief, Bari Weiss, spiked a fully vetted 60-minute segment at the very last minute.
The one on Venezuela.
The segment was prepared to reveal the torture and illegal deportation of nonviolent Venezuelan migrants who were sent to that supermax prison in El Salvador, the scandal we discussed earlier. The story was spiked despite having met all legal and editorial standards.
And the explanation given for spiking it reveals the mechanics of government media collusion.
The official reason was that the government refused to cooperate or provide commentary on the deportation scandal. The action is widely seen as protecting key administration figures, particularly Senator Marco Rubio and the Trump administration, from extreme embarrassment.
So spiking the story because the government refused to participate effectively granted the government a virtual kill switch.
A kill switch over major network news coverage of a sensitive topic. This action exposes CBS as potentially functioning as a mouthpiece for government propaganda. It lifts the mask on how corporate media operates to shield the powerful.
Finally, we saw renewed debate this week about a foundational American issue: the necessity of protecting states' rights from federal preemption, especially in areas like food safety and public health.
This is a complex conflict of principles versus practice. States' rights are essential for keeping people protected and allowing innovation in policy, environmental laws, public health standards.
But the integrity of the concept is undermined by its selective application.
Exactly. The problem is that Republicans, while nominally supporting states' rights, frequently override these very rights in specific areas like food safety or environmental regulation, specifically to placate their buddies in big business and lobbying groups.
So the principle is invoked when politically convenient and overridden when financially expedient for corporate backers.
That's it in a nutshell.
What's fascinating here is the sheer speed of change across every dimension we've talked about. The moral, the intellectual, the economic deterioration of Western primacy has accelerated so dramatically. It's pushing us into a moment of peril that sources are calling unparalleled since the period of 1914-1915, right before the outbreak of the Great War.
That's the definitive assessment. We are experiencing a rapid collapse of institutional trust and geopolitical stability. We've seen overwhelming evidence this week that the existing U.S. strategy, centered on maintaining global primacy through financial weaponization, tariffs, military escalation, is actively harming its own citizens.
Through inflation, debt, tariffs that hurt blue-collar workers.
Exactly. And simultaneously, it's structurally destroying key allies like Germany.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, the ruling oligarchies are losing very badly. They are failing to achieve their military, their economic, their industrial objectives, while at the same time incurring massive fiscal debt and losing moral authority through scandals and cover-ups.
Which raises an important question for you, the listener, to mull over. When the pursuit of global primacy becomes so institutionalized, so entrenched, that even elected leaders cannot change course, as we saw with the NDAA bill forbidding troop withdrawal, How long can the U.S. system sustain the overwhelming fiscal and military debt generated by maintaining a global empire that demonstrably no longer wants it there?
That internal contradiction between institutional mandate and fiscal reality.
That is the engine driving the current crisis.